Let's come back to this 29th presentation is giving the dynamic of time forms and its particular wisdom relationship to the feminine. It's not a question at all of what is superior. It's a question of appreciating what is quintessential for life to occur. It must be born. It must have a beginning. It must have a way to pattern its development, to sustain it, to work with the inevitable limitations of phenomenality so that they can be not done away with, which would be a purely masculine solution. Let's make sure that we never get sick, never die. That's not life. So that the feminine births and sustains the maturation, not through planning, but through guiding and through the acquisition of the capacity for rebirthing, which has very often its trigger, like the impregnation leading to a birth, to a masculine penetrative understanding, but with the feminine wisdom as further dimensions to this. In ancient Egypt, the figure that held this divine goddess quality was named Seshet. If you go to the web, S-E-S-H-A-T, and you will find a number of pages, and here she is. She is described as she who is the scribe. And here she is. She's inscribing on a royal staff. This royal staff is not the scepter of he who sits on the throne, but is the staff of the time limitations of his life. What he will be able to do if he accepts the guidance throughout the length which is here inscribed on the staff. But Seshet also is the one who, after that life has been lived, after whatever guidance has been accepted, he has then died and is going through the gates, the 12 gates of the netherworld. At each gate, he is challenged. The spirit is challenged, he or she. If there is a female king or emperor or pharaoh or whatever it is, each gate challenges with a riddle, with a challenge that cannot be resolved in terms of an integral. But like a koan, can only be lived with to emerge through. And she then inscribes the name of the person on a leaf of the Persea tree, a special rare species of laurel that is kept in the garden of Heliopolis in Egypt. And as she inscribes the name on the leaf of the Persea tree, Thoth, standing with her, inscribes his name in the registry book of eternity, whereas she inscribes his name on the eternal tree of life, the two trees of Eden, folks. If she does not inscribe his name on the tree of life, he cannot be reborn. Even if his name is inscribed on the book of eternity, rebirth is not possible. And because it's not possible, what is written in the book of eternity by Thoth will fade and eventually not be there. And in the ancient understanding of this, and I have included a classic page in the illustrations to our presentation notes, only those who are participating with this and through their kind participation and donations receive these notes. Observing Seshet writing the name on the laurel leaf of the Persea tree and Thoth writing the name in the tabulation of those in eternity is Osiris, the god of resurrection, who himself has only been possible to be the god of resurrection because only he has been resurrected by Isis, his lady. And not only Isis, but she collected all of the dismembered parts of Osiris by the arch red dog terrorist of the desert, Set, jealous that there should be an Osiris having an Isis and being supposedly one of the chief gods of reality, to cut him up and the dismembered parts scattered all over the ancient Near East. It is Isis who went from place to place, finding part after part, and the only of the 14 parts she could not find to bring Osiris back together was his penis. And so she had made a penis out of a special wood, and her powers of life were able to put that together with the reassembled Osiris. And not only did his body come back into being as himself, but the penis that she creatively offered and made available was incorporated to the extent that he was able to impregnate her with a son, Horus, so that Horus is radiant like the sun rising, because he is the child not just of gods, but he is the child of, like Kali, acquiescing in the most genitalia, insightful, basic way that the male should be able to have the fertility, the love, the sustaining, to be able to have a child, in this case a son, with her. One of the recent publications gotten from me from the courtesy of my wonderful wife and researcher Nisa, ordered for me, In Search of Cosmic Order, Selected Essays on Egypt and Archaeoastronomy, just published in Cairo by the American school there, and one of the great articles in here, one of the great contributions. In fact, the first one near the center is Unraveling Seshet, New Insights into the Stretching of the Cord Ceremony. Wonderful. What is the stretching of the cord? The cord is the basic teaching instrument of ancient geometry. Now you see that the preface of things is always like to fertilize a field. The ability to have a measurability so that one can understand phenomenality to such an extent that one can build a life or a building, an architecture, that only then, when one understands that there's an architecture to time, does one for the very first time begin to have the wake-up call, the idea birthed, the moment of thought, in Sanskrit a chitta, and in its higher dharma mode a bodhicitta, that this moment of thought, like a point of no dimensions, has movement. And the movement of a chitta, of the realization of a moment of thought, is like a Higgs boson coming into play, that one can condense even a vacuum and produce the ability for phenomenality not only to occur and emerge, but to have sustainability. Incredible sustainability. The proton has not lived out its lifetime of phenomenality yet. Any proton that comes into play, as far as we know, indefinitely. Protons made at the beginning of the Big Bang, some 400,000 years after, are still here. The lifetime of a proton exceeds the life of the universe so far. So the sustainability is enormous, and the ability to have a cord, a stretching of the cord, the ability to have a measurement that is trustworthy to be held, not just to be beheld, but to be held, the possibility of an architecture of all levels and all kinds of things. Seshet guarantees this. Thoth, in his pairing with her, records that this indeed not only emerges, births, sustains, guides, but withstands the destructions of whatever kind, and comes through reborn, to pursue further through a higher sustaining, a higher guiding, a high dharma to achieve eternity. It's all true. Even now. Aphrodite in mythology According to Hesiod's Theogony, she was born when Kronos cut off Uranus's genitals and threw them into the sea. Kronos is time. Uranus is the sky. Time cut off the male genitalia of the sky and threw it into the sea. Uranus, shortened to the Latin Uranus, for which the planet Uranus is named. And there's a whole mathematical website of Uranos, etc. But Uranus was the son of Gaia, and it is a peculiarity that it was supposed to be Gaia, Earth, herself, who gave birth to her son. But actually the esoteric, the mystery, the Pythagorean understanding held all the way through was that Earth, Gaia, was able to be impregnated by the ether. And it was the ether, yes, invisible, so that one could say, like a wise but not a high dharma writer like Hesiod, like the Theogony. His other great work is called Works and Days. Yes, he was wonderful, but he wasn't high dharma. He didn't understand the mysteries of higher dimensions at all, like Homer understood. The ether gives a quality to Gaia's son, so that when Kronos cut off his genitalia and threw them into the sea, out of Gaia's supposed reach, the father, the ether, was able to work through the ocean and to make a daughter emerge from the ocean named Aphrodite. The Greek word for waves like that is aphros. Not just the waves, but the foaming of the waves. Meaning the waves foam when they're able to come into contact with land. Submerged sandbars or whatever it is, the shore. Large waves make really a lot of foam. And when they come up onto the sand, they hiss with all kinds of bubblings and froth and foam and so forth. Aphrodite was born of that foam, of the ether able to bring the impregnation into the waters, not just of the earth, but of the water, the oceans themselves. Botticelli's great Birth of Venus shows her coming ashore in a seashell. So powerful was the great Hermetic teaching given to Botticelli that the seashell is a recognizable ancient wisdom symbol. It's a very special kind of seashell. And there it is in Botticelli's painting, because Botticelli's teacher, Marsilio Ficino, in the High Dharma Renaissance, was not only the translator of Plato, all of his dialogues, all of his works, but the first translation into a modern language of the ancient Hermetica, just recently brought from the crumbling of Byzantium, falling to Mehmed the Conqueror after years of besieging the triple walls of Byzantium with cannon and the fleeing wisdom people with a few of the books. Always this happens. If somebody didn't save those books, Seshet's work as the writer not only of books but of the Tree of Life and the language of writing of Thoth, that the book is the interface of this wisdom. That seashell, take a look at Botticelli's painting, is the reward for pilgrims going on a quest. And they go on a quest that stretches about 250 miles from the Pyrenees down into northern Spain, across northern Spain, very close to the coast, to a small city that St. James went to in 41 AD. And it takes its name, St. James in Spanish, Santiago, but a special quality of St. James, a special quality of Santiago del Compostela. St. James of the starry fields. All the starry fields. Not just a Uranus of the sky, but a Uranus of the whole heavens, the cosmos. And each successful pilgrim that makes that, and some 200,000 people a year still make that pilgrimage. They're awarded there in Santiago del Compostela the seashell. It's like the shell for the symbol, oddly enough, of shell oil. If you ever see the great comedy, Some Like It Hot, Billy Wilder with Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon and Marilyn Monroe. Tony Curtis bragging about his yacht and his wealth to Marilyn Monroe to have his way, says, our company has a monogram, and he holds up a seashell. Oh, I've heard of that, she says. It's this. You're hearing of the way in which, at the very same time that St. James left Jerusalem, he had tutored the young St. Mark from age 10 through his bar mitzvah, and saw that he was now a young man, not just a boy learning, but a young man ready for better guidance, and left him in charge of St. Peter, and went off to northern Spain, to what became Santiago de Compostela. At the very time he did that, the disciples of Jesus, Thomas and Matthew, set off together to go south and east, and Matthew accompanied St. Thomas, and St. Matthew went all the way down to Ethiopia. And St. Thomas went on further to India. St. Matthew went to Ethiopia because St. Philip had converted, through a direct transmission, the head of the great caravan that for 1,000 years had run between ancient Ethiopia was not only in the African Ethiopia, but was in part of southern Arabian Peninsula known as Yemen. And those two together, that section of Ethiopia and section of Yemen, were known as Sheba. That's where the Queen of Sheba came from in Solomon's time. And in St. Philip's time, there was another queen in the lineage that was almost always masculine, and this time it was Queen Candace. And so, because Philip and Matthew and Thomas were the three, like a triad, like a triangle, who were meant to make the inscription, the Gospels, the record of what happened, Matthew, Thomas, and Philip, their Gospels make a triad. Matthew stayed in Ethiopia with the court of Queen Candace and eventually died there. Thomas went on to India. In a special way, the South India, the Malabar coast, where all the Semitic Jewish traders were trading with Africa. Probably not trading in motorcycles. And northern India, where he went to King Gondophares, who had written a letter to Jesus, please send me an architect to build a palace in keeping with your teachings. I've heard wonderful things about you. Not just because he taught for 3 years in Palestine, but because he taught for over 30 years in Alexandria. And everybody in northern India who was of the Greek king lineage since Alexander the Great's time knew the truth about the wisest man in Alexandria for several decades was Jesus. And so Gondophares' letter reached Jesus, and he gave it to Thomas, who was an architect. He was from Damascus. And his architectural helper's name was Thaddeus. And later on, when it came time for the apostles, the disciples who were apostles, to go out and radiate the word, Thomas sent Thaddeus to the north to what has become the Armenians. And Thomas himself then went with Matthew down the Red Sea, all the way, Matthew to Ethiopia and he to southern Egypt, the Malabar coast, now called Kerala, that area, and then on by ship up to the northern part, the part which was then still identifiable as Gandhara, a part of in between Kashmir and Bactria. And it was that part that the Greek kingdoms had reached a high watermark of the normal elder's wisdom. One of the classics of late Buddhism, before there was a Mahayana, is the questions of King Milinda, which is a way in which the Indians pronounced Menander, Melinda. Most of the writings were in a southern version of Sanskrit, of Magadhi, dialect of Sanskrit called Pali. And it's like a southern accent of Sanskrit. Melinda, Menander. And since the time of Megasthenes and so forth, Alexander's Greco-Buddhist empire there in northern India had reached out, like good Greeks, with all kinds of trade routes, and had reached all the way into Central Asia, had reached all the way down to the Malabar coast, all the way out, so that there was a whole pattern, even going around the tip of India and going up the Coromandel coast on the east coast of India. And there, along the Coromandel coast, archaeology has found in the late 20th century all kinds of Roman coins. And one of them is a very rare, expensive, golden Roman coin that has as its face the Roman Emperor Hadrian, with his full royal name, Hadrianus Augustus, the inheritor of Augustus Caesar, Hadrian, who was given that opportunity through Trajan, who reinstated the Roman Empire power after the great corruption of the Caesars and of the Flavians, had brought it back to what it became great for the next 100 years or so. That coin was minted about 125 AD. And that coin was not found on the coast, it was found inland, on the southern bank of the Krishna River, at a place called Nargajuna Khanda. The Khanda in that South India dialect is hill, Nargajuna's hill, because one of the greatest of all the Mahayana high Dharma writers and figures was Nargajuna. And there was this huge outcropping of a rocky edifice coming up from a very fertile, beautiful valley. And that valley eventually, over several hundred years, became one of the biggest complexes of intelligence in the world, of central stupa, of viharas, of chaityas, and in that complex, the essential beginnings of it were designed by Nargajuna because he was also an architect. Many of these people were architects. Jesus' father, Joseph, was not just a carpenter. He was an architect. Could build anything. He had a source of trees in Lebanon because he was a partner in those forests. Really quite somebody. Where do you think the wood came from? We're talking about understanding context and patterning and depth, which is not anywhere available so that it can be understood. Not to teach, but to guide. Go and see for yourself. Check it out. Nargajuna lived 100 years. He not only designed the beginnings of what became Nargajuna Khanda, became that great center, but down the Krishna River, big bend in the Krishna River, and if you went overland, it'd be about 70-some miles. He built what was the most powerful of all the Buddhist temples of the Mahayana, and it's called Amaravati. And he designed Amaravati in such a way that it was a high Dharma, gorgeous art transform of the great stupa that King Ashoka built in the very center of India at Sanchi. And the architecture of Sanchi is one of the treasures of the world. Sanchi not only is a great stupa, but it has 4 triple column torii-like gates, Torana. And they face the 4 directions. And those 4 directions with that kind of a stupa quality are exactly what one finds in the stupas and the chaityas like at Ajanta that we talked about last week, and we'll talk about more. But when one begins to understand the architecture, of architects, of civilization has an architecture to it. And one needs to understand that if one is going to rebirth civilization. Because everything that was there is corrupted beyond saving. And it will have the same career that Homer says the dead have. When they go to the fields of asphodel, the Hades, they begin to fade and fade and fade and fade. And eventually they will fade away. Their death is not that someone killed them, it's that their own inability to sustain themselves or anything else fades from view and finally evaporates. They don't need to be fought and killed. They will evaporate. They have no power of staying. They have no life. When Circe tells Odysseus how to interview the fallen dead in Hades and how to come back out, he's to take a bowl of blood. They look for blood. Blood through violence, blood through rape, blood through whatever it is, in order to sustain and stop their fading for a while. Dante in the Inferno, with his guide Virgil, sees the interminable, closed, little lemming-like qualities of those whose corruption is that they cannot stop themselves. That's evil. More next week.